right. Well, it looks like we have quite a few people here. So, can everyone hear me?
Yeah, you sound awful, Greg.
Oh no, I'm all right. I'm fine. Just had a little frog in my throat.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, I'm fine. I'm
It's
feeling.
Is it like 3 a.m. over there right now?
Yeah, it's 3 a.m.
Wow.
Yeah. So I had to have stand up at 11 in the evening, and then community
Crazy.
hangout at 3 a.m. Yeah, after a day of conferencing. So it's a lot of fun. This is,
Wow. Well,
but
thanks
it's just the same. It's just the same in Seattle, right? But glad to be here.
well, thanks for making it.
Yeah, no, my pleasure, my pleasure. Well, let's go ahead and get started with the technical update. Rao, you're muted.
I'm sorry, I was speaking, but I was on mute. Everybody should be able to see Community Update 101. Do you see that? Hello.
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
All right. So we are at the moment trying to release 0918, but the per validator vault, we were running some integration tests this morning. There is still 1 or 2 tests that are failing. We're still resolving that issue. Hopefully tomorrow we'll have 0918 released once these problems are resolved. That's kind of where we are with that. And once we release 0918, we'll essentially be in public beta. So that's kind of where we are. Also this week, from in terms of number of developers and developer hours, has been relatively light. Kind of many developers are on vacation as an extension of the Thanksgiving holiday. But this particular issue, the per validator vault, is something that we're focusing on and trying to complete. That's where we are. Then other than that, we have the hardening work going on. There is some secure access to protocol private proof of stake methods. That's kind of being worked on, but Tim is working on this per validator vault right now, so he'll get back to it once the per validator vault stuff is done. And then we're looking at the status has not changed on this issue that I talked about last week. We're looking at the issue that sometimes on some contracts, if they fail, then we're not able to proceed forward on the node. So we're putting in better exception handling for that. Most of the rest of the things with this HTTP interface, Tomislav is continuing work on that. And we are trying to rebase and look at RCat so that it can be used and integrated with other pieces, or it could be used by dApp developers. And on performance, we're finding a couple of other things. The latest one, I guess, is this one PR that I'm kind of, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the third bullet under performance improvements. We noticed that has substantially reduced performance, and we are looking or investigating into that, as well as that 2812 pull request, which is a replay or space matching. That's something also that's being looked at. Now, the last time I said it, some change we did there gave a 14x improvement, and I want to correct that because we ran more tests since then, and the performance improvement seems to be variable on that. Sometimes we're getting a 1.6x improvement, sometimes we're getting a lot more. So we're kind of trying to understand what's going on with that, and it may well be that the performance improvement from that particular change will be variable, but it will always be variable. But at least we're just trying to try a few more tests on that and try and understand what's going on with that. And as far as the 2637 pull request, the issue is not so much anything in that particular PR itself, but how that changes the behavior in the rest of the system might be causing the changes. So some of these are a little dynamic and complicated to analyze, but we're continuing to look into those. That's, I guess, is the overall overall technical update. Are there any questions on this? The main thing we're focused on is just getting this per validator vault feature pass tests and get it merged in, and then release the 0918 for public beta. That's kind of where we are.
So were there 2 tests failing after the timestamp?
Yeah, right. There are, well, the timestamp tests are done. Now the tests that are failing, actually, Tim is not sure if the integration tests need to be modified to account for the new per validator vault feature, but he asked Will to look at that. So we should get a resolution on that in the next day or so.
Okay, good. That sounds good. And with respect to the variability, is that variability on the dupe contract, or only the dupe contract, or straight line code as well?
You're talking about performance variability, or?
Yeah, the performance variability. That's right.
So it seems to be it seems to be not just on dupe. I mean, we're running different contracts, so we are seeing different degrees of improvement on that. I mean, overall, I think the changes are good. At least we have not seen any degradation from it. The question is, how much is the improvement? So I think it's just a matter of resolving. I mean, we don't have to necessarily resolve how much the improvement is, as long as we know it's improvement and it's not a degradation. And then we can move forward with that. I mean, logically, there's no reason why they would degrade, and they are certainly showing improvement. But we're running multiple contracts on that.
Okay, all right. That's what I wanted to know, was whether or not we had consistent performance variability under straight line contracts with no recursion.
Yeah,
because the recursion is definitely something that we want to improve. That has to be done. But I think a lot of contracts in the wild are going to be straight line contracts. And we can also add, some kind of, fold feature that can be done primitively underneath the covers. In fact, I have that spec in the language. Fold as a primitive. So if fold is a primitive, then you can do a whole bunch of recursions without having to do the sort of banged instance the way it's been done in the past. So okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that would be a significant speed up for a class of recursive contracts. All right. So
okay. So we should get that on the schedule. Yeah.
Sure. So moving on then, unless there are any other technical questions about the tech update. I'll move on to some other updates. So I was at, I gave a talk in Guangzhou, where I am currently, at a special dinner that was before the conference. And then we've been at the conference all day, and there's been significant interest, quite serious interest in the project. I can talk about that in more detail at the closed door session on Friday. But so suffice it to say that there really is quite a lot of interest in the project, especially now that we're about to go into public beta and nearing mainnet. So I think that's a really good news all the way around. More details, but the Chinese community, I think, has been and continues to be very supportive of RChain. It's very heartening to see how many people are excited about the project and are putting in long hours to promote the project. It's really very encouraging. And we are looking into developing a Chinese entity, an organization. So while the co-op format does have a long history in China, it's largely for agricultural entities. So it may or may not be the best legal structure for such an entity over here. But we want to set it up in such a way that it's cooperative in spirit, if not legally. So we're trying to think through all of that. And we're also thinking about how the relationship between the governance of the US and the governance of the Chinese entity. So that's under consideration. One possibility is that members in the U.S. entity can vote for board members and other items of business in the Chinese entity, and vice versa. So while their local interfaces to the specific jurisdictions, they're global in the sense that the entire community can have a voice in both entities. So that's something that is of interest, I think, here, and I think is probably a good way to go. But I'd love to hear from anyone here who has thoughts or questions about that.
Greg, I'm wondering whether there is a structure that could be set up where the Chinese company would be more of a subsidiary of the co-op. Is that a possibility? More of a parent-child relationship?
It is possible. It's not very decentralized. So, I mean, I have a kind of psychological resistance to that. And I think that the Chinese community would also find that less appealing. Why would we want the U.S. entity to be dominant over the Chinese entity?
Well, I guess we are the co-op. We're a member-based organization, and I think that we would want to kind of just at least in some way make sure that that we all adhere to the same vision.
Sure. No, that part I think is crystal clear, and I agree with that. I'm just not sure that a centralized structure adheres to the vision. I'm looking for ultimately for a more decentralized structure, where the entities cooperate, sort of like autonomous processes in parallel composition, opposed to some top-down organization.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, what's the is the fear that they'll? I mean, so far the Chinese community has been super supportive, right? Especially in the last 6 months, they've been incredibly supportive. So, I think that we ultimately have to, the world that we're trying to engender is a world of trust. And I know it's very hard. It's been a long road, a very difficult road to create trust. But I think the people who have stuck with the project through thick and thin have an understanding of what trust means. And that's what we're really trying to create. I hope.
Oh yeah, I would highly concur with what you're saying. I guess I'm looking at it less as a kind of centralized move and more as, I guess, I repeat myself, but I take to the Mozilla Foundation / corporation model as guidance. And I guess, the thing that I like about that model is that there is a strong manifesto in the Mozilla Foundation. And because the corporation is a wholly owned subsidiary, its number one mandate is to actually follow the manifesto, follow the vision. And then the number two mandate is to make money. And I guess just my concern is that money becomes this centralized focus in our quest for Jupiter.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the way I had hoped to solve this was to imagine that we have a whole coin, right? And we cut it into 7 pieces. And you just don't get a whole coin unless you have all the pieces. So with respect to RChain Europe, which unfortunately is now defunct, but the relationship between RChain Europe and RChain US was governance tools, right? So to have, the entire community needs to have a say in the governance of the technology and the organizational structure. And it's best if that's on chain. So governance tools for collecting expression of sentiment and expression of will ultimately are necessary to have a fully functioning chain. But those tools can't exist unless you have the platform on which to build them. So there's a kind of mutually recursive relationship. Those two entities, whether it's RChain Europe and RChain US or any other entity that would take on that role, that remit, that's a clear, that they clearly need each other. And my hope would be that we could find several different aspects of the whole organization that could be supplied by different parts of different cooperatives around the world, or organizations or entities, whatever they're called. So what I've been trying to work on with the Chinese entity is to find that special mutually recursive relationship, so that there's a need that each party provides.
I love that. I love the idea of kind of like a global interdependence built into the architecture.
Yeah. That's really the idea, and and with a kind of interdependence, then we don't have to have an overarching entity, whether it's in the US or in Europe or in China or anywhere else in the world. There can be, there doesn't have to be, we can relax because there's no one in charge.
It's all brave new world stuff. It's like, It's crazy, but it's exciting to think about, forging new relationships between the United States and China in ways that that just, ultimately make the world a better place.
Yeah, exactly. No, I
It's
agree.
exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I'll just say this. The only case study you have is RChain Europe. So if we want to replicate the model with peppering better governance structures or whatever, that's fine, but you need to put in place risk management. So I'm personally in favor of giving the Chinese, what they need, the tools, the collateral, the assets they need to get something going. And I know for a fact they're bought in. That's not the question. That's not the concern. The concern is, what is the risk management procedures? What can we do differently? Because the only case study we have is Pythia Reflective in RChain Europe, and that's not looking too hot. So if we can come up with that protocol and those improvements, then I think we should get going on it immediately. But
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. So I think each was problematic for different reasons. Right. I think with RChain Europe, the real issue is that they just didn't quite have enough runway to stand up on their own 2 feet. And that was largely because of the crypto winter, right? That was the issue for them. So I don't see it as the same kind of risk. So with respect to RChain China, I think we have a really different a different landscape. In particular, the President Xi, made blockchain research a high priority in China, and because of that, there's just blockchain is exploding over here, even though they're tightening up restrictions on that make it difficult to have sort of fly by night pump and dump schemes. They are very, very excited about blockchain because of this emphasis from the government. So it's a very different situation than it was
I
in
agree with that.
2018.
I think we can't get rid of all the business risks, right? But
Yeah.
the fact is that we're still in a bear market. If we're just gonna take the checkpoint of, hey, we're under 20K, and the only reason we ran up is arguably because of the plus token Ponzi scheme that blew up at the 14K top. So, I mean, we can't get rid of that over macro risk. But all I'm saying is, what can we do on a very detailed level with the contracts and the legal agreements between both entities? If it's a completely separate entity, just as Reflective Ventures was, are we going to have clawbacks in the contract if something goes wrong? These are all just things that we can take offline, but I think those details in the contracts and before you form the entities will help greatly, because we are more experienced as an organization. There's absolutely no question about that. So, like I said, onward and upward. I would think it's a great opportunity.
Yeah, agreed. Awesome. Any other questions or comments from the community?
How far have you come with finding what role China would play in the platform and its governance?
Right now, it seems to be largely about opening up the Chinese market in particular. That seems to be the one that everyone can agree needs to be done, and needs to be done with boots on the ground. So there's not a lot of interest in the sort of tooling side of governance that there was interest of in Europe. But everyone agrees that opening up the market and having sort of smooth access to the markets is the one role and function that everyone agrees is best done by people here in China.
And for decision making over the platform, how would you separate this out between jurisdictions? So would China have their own jurisdiction and US have its own?
Yeah,
So not sure how to balance that.
The Chinese entity would be under Chinese law, and the U.S. entity would be under U.S. law. Now, with respect to decisions on the platform, I think everyone also agrees that the U.S. is the center of gravity for decisions about the platform. But this is kind of what why we've been contemplating the mutual recursion being more in terms of decision making. So anyone who is a member of the Chinese organization is automatically a member of the U.S. organization, and as a result gets to vote in the U.S. AGM, as an example, and vice versa.
So, Greg, just for clarity, when you say platform, do you mean both the co-op structure as a legal entity and the tech? Because when I hear the word platform, I immediately think about RNode, meaning that if all the core devs are funneled in through contracts, right, through the U.S. company, and all your source code devs are the ones who are doing the GitHub updates, obviously the center of gravity would lay in the U.S. company, right? But when you say platform, just curious, like, what do you mean specifically? Are you talking about the code, the RNode, or are you talking about the co-op, or are you talking about both?
So when we talk about, in this context, the platform refers to not just the code, but the network, right? Because there's also this whole operational piece. So it's the code, it's the development of the code and the care and feeding of some significant number of nodes.
Right. Okay. Yeah, because I imagine like I can imagine an example where, let's say, for example, for some reason we spin up this company, the equity vehicle in China is just getting money thrown left, right, and center. And that's just because of jurisdiction, tax reasons, whatever it is. Like, it could be whatever. But then they spin up, like, 3-4 times as many nodes as the U.S. arm is running. And that's fine in the beginning, right? But let's just say, like, globally, there's not that many people running nodes yet. Now, the Chinese arm has control of the network, right? Because
not necessarily. It depends.
Okay.
Right. It depends on whether or not those nodes are in the root shard. And
right.
we have a fixed total number of seats in the root shard.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes.
So I got you.
Yeah. So
I mean, ultimately, it doesn't really matter. I mean, because again, the argument is like, who is working on the core protocol, right? If all your devs are still contracted through the U.S. arm, it's not like completely decentralized. Like, again, Bitcoin Core, right? That's pretty much a company at this point. Like, the entire Bitcoin network relies on that software.
Right, but the way that shakes out is Bitcoin Core is, so that there are three entities, right? There's token holders, the core dev, and the miners. Those are your three different influences. So if people all sell off Bitcoin to the point that the price is not interesting, then you can't really fund Bitcoin Core and you can't really fund mining. If the miners refuse to mine, if they for example shift all their hash power to some other problem, then again the network begins to falter. If the core dev strike, for example, then again the network begins to falter. So all three of them have a kind of influence or power, and it's balanced amongst the three of them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that actually adds much more clarity. It's not as simple as devs have all power. That's just not the case, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Even
So
though I want
it's
to believe
really
that because we're kind of relying on the devs to get the code out, but no, in real life, in reality, the stakeholders are much more. It's broken into different categories. So that is a good point.
Yeah. So the same is going to be true of RChain, but there's going to be further articulation because the one thing that's missing in the Bitcoin picture is governance. Right? There's no governance of the network that is explicit. Whereas in the case of RChain, we explicitly made the cooperative structure. Its role and function is like if people want to change the network, they want to change the features in the code base, or they want to change, for example, the total number of slots in the root shard, or they want to change the seniorage fee, or whatever it is, then the co-op structure is providing that governance for the network. And so that's a fourth piece. And so then the relationship of the different cooperatives needs to be further articulated. But that's kind of how I see it. So you still have, token holders, validators, and dev, and then there's the governance piece, which in some sense is acting as a control valve for those entities or influences to interface. Cool. Any other questions or comments from the community?
There's a question from Jeremy Q.
Okay.
How are limited root shard spots allocated?
So that's a good question. It's actually spelled out in the spec, which is on the wiki page, and has been up for almost a year. But I'll speak to that. So there's a process by which those parties that want to participate as nodes in the Genesis block, there's sort of a bootstrap phase. So the co-op kind of needs to review the initial validator set, and then after that, there's a bonding and unbonding part of the protocol. So as spaces open up because a validator unbonds, then other candidates can bond, and there's policy around you can't unbond for at least 4 months. That's kind of the minimum amount of presence in the network that we need for secure network security. And then there's the bonding pool, where you have a number of requests, and then they're selected at random from the parties that have gone into the pool. And then there's a 2-week period from the notification that you've been selected for bonding, so that you don't have to have hardware provisioned at a moment's notice, right? So like if you provision the hardware and it's just sitting there and you don't know when you're going to be bonded, that's costly. Also, if you have been selected for bonding but you don't have the hardware spun up, kind of scrambling to provision the hardware is also costly. So we have this 2-week period from when you're notified that you have been selected for bonding to spin up or provision the hardware. And then there's a corresponding sort of unbonding period, sort of a transition phase out of being a bonded validator. That should give you a rough idea of how this works. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it seems like he responded. He said, understood, yet as let's say the co-op unbonds to decentralize the network, there is no KYC to be allowed in. So I guess Jeremy, are you asking, like, do you
There isn't really a
Yeah.
KYC process. I mean, even if we KYC a particular organization that wants to run nodes in the root shard, we don't know that they haven't virtualized the IP that they're using for a particular node. Like it's
Right.
next to impossible to make sure that there's one-to-one correspondence between validator IDs and distinct hardware/software. That's not possible.
But the hedge against that is the slashing, correct? So if they do anything malicious, they're out.
Sure,
Yeah.
if they do anything malicious, they're out, but that doesn't mean that but you still have a degradation of the security of the network if you don't have near one-to-one correspondence. And the reason is because you could have failure that brings down 20 nodes by the crash of one machine.
Yeah, but can't you bake in a protocol so that if you go down with a pool of nodes, you take a very heavy penalty when that happens? Like, because if you go offline on Casper, as far as I understand it, you're taking a penalty, right? If you just turn off.
If you go offline, you definitely take a penalty.
Right.
But it's still we can't verify that it was that just because 20 validators disappeared, that it was necessarily because they were virtualized. It could be that there was a network issue or other things. Now, it could come out during some adjudication process or reconciliation process that was what was going on, in which case some reconciliation can occur. But again, it's not this part is just gray. There's not much we can do about the ambiguity here. All we can do is just set up the incentives so that people are more incentivized.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to look at it from the other side, right? They need to do some risk management, right? So if let's say they have X number of tokens for staking, it doesn't make sense to put all your eggs in one basket.
Precisely.
It makes a lot more sense to take and spread that X tokens over some number of validators, and then from the other side of risk management, if you virtualize all those validators to try to cut corners, then if you have a failure, you're going to be hit really hard.
When you say virtualize, do you mean just running your node on VPS?
I mean that each IP address that's provided for the validator, it actually maps back to the same.
I see. Okay.
Underlying IP address, right?
Gotcha.
So you're really, all of those validators are running on the same hardware. It looks like they don't.
That's really stupid.
Well, no. I mean, there's lots and lots of web architectures that do exactly that, right? So they have virtualized IP addresses and virtualized infrastructure mapping back to the same hardware.
Are those architectures securing economic assets?
No.
I didn't think so.
Not necessarily.
Right. Okay. I understand your point, though.
Yeah. So someone may be cutting costs that way.
Right. Fair.
That's
fair.
It's a way of cutting costs. Right?
It's a risk, but I guess you're right. It seems to me there's no real way to, if you're penalized, yeah, it'd have to go through some. You have to prove like it'd be some, yeah, as you're saying, some process where you talk to us or we try to figure out what happened, and it just, I don't know, that could be bottlenecking because
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it can be
That's
bottlenecking.
exactly. Yeah, so we have to kind of manage those situations. Hopefully, Jeremy, we've answered your question without getting too far in the weeds.
So he says, so eventually over time, the root shard validators may not be known entities. If so, this is a good thing.
Sort of. We always want, the co-op is always going to maintain a certain number of nodes. And this is for economic reasons. One of the co-op's revenue streams is running nodes. Then that's always been the case. And then the other point is that we want there to not just be a root shard, but there to be a whole tree of shards. And out beyond the root shard, we'd like to see, more and more decentralization. As you get closer and closer to the root shard, there should be at least some number of nodes that are directly under, recognized RChain entities, because they're it's a revenue stream for those RChain entities.
And then Jeremy says, understood, thank you, hopefully a minority.
Okay. Yeah, I think over time, we want there to be the co-ops. The U.S. co-op is not the centralized entity running the majority of the nodes. Yeah, that's correct.
If the bacon is there, people are going to come and set up. There's absolutely set up shop, right? There's absolutely no doubt. So the consensus model, promotes that.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing that's been discussed, this is still sort of pie in the sky, but there appears to be some interest in setting up an RChain research center, under the auspices of some local government here in China. So that could be very beneficial to the whole community. And to that end, I would love to reinvigorate, because we need technical work done. Like the dev team is going to be working on, maintenance of the current release and development of the next release, but they're not necessarily going to look at the release past that or the release past that. And especially with respect to feature development. So I really wanted there to be a research organization that's looking, its short-term research goals are, the next two releases beyond the current release and the release that's under development. So that's one thing. And then I think it's also really, really important to stay on top of developments in quantum compute and development in AI, both as relate to blockchain. So those are two really, really important areas for research. And then another important area of research is these kind of models for emergent organization. In fact, I'm hoping that the next RCast we can talk about that. So I've put forward 4 distinct models in the form of games that illustrate the kinds of things that I'm talking about. So I'll talk about those in detail I've talked about them before in this community, but I'll talk about them again as illustrations of the kind of tools for self-organization and the more people get experience with these kinds of tools for self-organization, the more I think people will begin to understand how to use the underlying techniques in those tools to devise more sophisticated tools for self-organization. So that's another area of research that I think is really going to be important. And then finally, I think we have to have governance research. We have to have people actively looking at what does it take to help us become more effective in terms of our ability to coordinate. So those are areas where I think a research center with some dedicated teams in each of those areas could dramatically impact. Oh, and of course, there's the whole hardware area. So the road chip and other hardware-related developments. So that's another area where I think we actually have to have, teams working on this stuff.
So Greg, I have a question about that. So when you say research group, do you necessarily mean a like some sort of institute? Because usually institutes are usually funded by like government grants or very wealthy.
Yeah, that's what we're talking. That's
Okay.
what we're talking about. Is that there would be government funding for RChain research.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm very curious. The last bit too is if you're talking about hardware, you're talking about patents, aren't you? So what, like who?
No,
not necessarily. No. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure.
No. Patents are you don't have to apply for patents.
Okay.
Like there are so many things that I could have patented,
right,
for RChain, and I put them out in the open source.
Right. Yeah. Just saying, it's like when I hear the word chip, I think about fabrication. I think about, Bitmain. Like, are they going to be the ones supplying the chips? Or is it, like, that's a stupid. It's an overgeneralization, but just off the top of my head, like what suppliers are you getting in relationships to build those chips and things like that. I also,
but that's not necessarily the research side. That's
okay.
the production side.
Production side. Okay, so it's completely separate. Yeah, okay. Then the other bit was, as far as I understand it, it just was watching a interview with Bill Gates, and he claims that most of the research in AI at the university level is almost as good as the commercial AI that is being built by corporations. So I would say that it's probably in our best interest to get some sort of research institute going, because you can get your fingers into not only the corporate sector but also the academic circles globally. So I think it's also a very good idea.
Yeah. I mean, those areas for research are necessary if RChain is going to remain competitive, right? They're also necessary if we're going to achieve our goals, right? If the goal is to have a global compute infrastructure that's fast enough so that you could have over 100 trillion smart contracts running concurrently. There isn't an architecture on the planet right now that supports that in a decentralized fashion. But that's pretty much what we have to contemplate if we're talking about decentralizing Facebook in such a way that every post on Facebook is its own smart contract. Those are the numbers that we're looking at. It's roughly 100 trillion concurrently running smart contracts. So if that's our goal, then we have to have, a hardware solution for running Rowline. That we're straight to native. We're not going through, the JVM, which is super, super inefficient.
So Greg, one more question real quick. I'm not a software architect, so off the top of my head, I can't even begin to answer this question, but what about using any type of supercomputing resources? Is the architectures of the systems able to be utilized in ownership RChain?
I mean, the interesting point is that, you know, supercomputing has kind of merged with a lot of the big data and other kinds of. I mean, supercomputing used to be about, you know, concurrency, and then everybody went concurrent. So, I mean, there's certainly a possibility, right? So, if there are research labs that are still engaged in this kind of supercompute idea, then it would be nice to look at those, look at what architectures are emerging now. But a lot of the older architectures are essentially superseded by what's happening in modern data centers. I mean, really, Google is the world's largest supercomputer.
Fair.
So, you know, that architecture is more or less well understood at this point.
Yeah, fair.
I don't think, you know, I could be wrong, but I don't think there's a significant competitive advantage to running on a Cray anymore.
Right, got you.
And that's just because of the end of Moore's law, right? That was kind of an inevitability. Okay, we've been yammering on for quite some time. Any other questions or comments from the community? Okay, thank you so much. Be seeing some of you on Friday, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Greg.